This is the Community Builder Podcast, Episode 2. I'm your host, Travis King. Coming up on this episode, I sit down with Jayson Gaignard. Jayson is an author, podcaster, and networking specialist. Named one of Forbes' top networkers to watch, Jayson is the founder of MastermindTalks. MastermindTalks is an invitation-only 3-day live experience that brings together some of the world's most fascinating people. With an acceptance rate lower than Harvard University, the event brings together brilliant minds from business thought leaders to industry trailblazers and New York Times bestselling authors. Let's get into the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Community Builder Podcast. And today I'm super excited to sit down with Jayson Gaignard. How are you doing today, Jayson?
Dude, I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
Same. I'm super excited, and have been excited ever since James initially, introduced us, and, really want to expose the community to all the amazing things you've been up to at MMT. So would you mind telling the audience kind of a little bit about yourself, kind of where you're from, your quick background, and would love to dive in.
Yeah. So based just outside of Toronto. So I'm kind of born and raised in Toronto, Canada. And basically the short version of my story was that I dropped out of high school. I wasn't much of an academic, unfortunately. And I started a service-based business and realized quickly that service-based businesses are hard to scale. So I pivoted into an online product business, which we grew to about $6-7 million a year over 4 years with no outside investments. And I was traveling the world, making a ton of money. With all that money and all that free time, I started to ask myself questions like, why am I here? Will I be remembered? How many people show up to my funeral? And I was not happy with the answers I was giving myself. And after being an entrepreneur for 7 years, ultimately, I discovered that I built a business I hated to enable me to buy things I didn't need, to impress people I didn't like. So I became comfortable with getting out of that business, and I could have positioned it for sale, but the only problem was that it would have been like a year or 2 year process to kind of get the business ready, find a buyer, and then do some kind of earn out. And I just couldn't do it to myself. So I became comfortable with scaling that business down to zero over like about a 1 year period. And unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. My goal was to land at zero, have a little bit of cash left to start something new. Unfortunately, on the way down, two things happened that were beyond my control that landed me $250,000 in debt. And basically, when the dust settled, that was like August of 2012. And that was kind of my rock bottom, so to speak, because being $250,000 in debt, I had no business, no cash flow, didn't know what I was going to do next. My daughter was turning 6 months old, and I was having a hard time adjusting to that. I just got married to my wife the following month in September. So there's a saying that when one door closes, another one opens, but it sucks to be stuck in the hallway. And that was a very dark hallway for me at the time. And then in that transition time, this all happened in August. In September, a friend of mine posted to Facebook that they had a extra ticket to go see Seth Godin in New York. And I've always been a big fan of Seth's work, and I had no other obligations at the time. So I decided to take her up on this opportunity. And I went to this workshop, and I had no clue what it was about. But when I got there, the theme of it was the connection economy and how there's huge value connecting like-minded individuals. And at the time, I felt very disconnected and isolated as an entrepreneur. So when I came back to Toronto, I started hosting these things called Mastermind dinners, where I'd invite 8 entrepreneurs out for dinner with the core focus of connecting them. And the first one I did, I almost canceled 2 hours prior because I'm like, nobody's going to see value in this. They're going to think I completely wasted their time. But thankfully, it turned out to be a great success. And I just got clarity that evening that connecting people was, or just being in the presence of just fascinating people was something I wanted to do to some capacity for the rest of my life. And not necessarily as a business, because I wasn't actually monetizing these dinners. I was paying for them out of pocket, which, being $250,000 in debt, and I was basically on the brink of bankruptcy, and that's how I kind of rationalized doing these dinners, was that the bank could take my car, they could take whatever measly assets I have left, but they can't take my relationships. So investing in my relationships to me were the safest investment I could make. And about a month or two after that, I had an opportunity that kind of landed on my lap to do an event with a guy named Tim Ferriss, who's a well-known business author. He has, I think, 5 New York Times bestselling books now. And just saw it as a chance for me to do what I do in these dinners, but on a larger scale. And our first event what was only supposed to be our only event took place in May of 2013. And I always say that ignorance, confidence, and hard work can go a long way when you're an entrepreneur. I had no clue what I was doing whatsoever. But that actually turned out to work in our benefit. And, our event turned out to be almost more similar to like a wedding than it was a conference. And it was application only. We had 4,200 entrepreneurs apply for that first event. Because that first event worked out so well, we decided to do a second event because most of my friends in the event space, the common disclaimer about that industry is that it's really hard to make a successful business in the event space. So we decided to do a second one to prove that the first one wasn't a fluke, because I thought the first one was probably a fluke as well. But thankfully, the second one turned out to be a big success, and we just wrapped up our 6th live experience in Park City in September, and our next one is in Cabo in October, so a little less than a year away, and that's sold out. In 2020, we're bringing it to South Carolina.
Wow. That's impressive. Thanks so much for the fast forward rewind. And I guess if you wouldn't mind, I would love to dive into kind of that moment when you kind of first got started, because it seems like to me, this is from my point of view, you kind of been through the entrepreneurial, like full life cycle already.
Sure.
Like right now, entrepreneurship is very hot and very, trendy, but you've kind of been through that full life cycle. So could you talk to us a little bit about kind of when you realized like things weren't going so well, and kind of what you did to get out of that?
Yeah. So, and it's funny that you address it as a life cycle, because there is definitely the people that we serve with at Mastermind Talks, they're very successful at what they do. And there's actually, there's a saying by Zig Ziglar that you go from survival to sustainability to success, and then success to significance. And I find myself in that position where, I reached a certain level of success and I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. And now what? And a lot of my peers are kind of in that same position as well, that they're seeking significance on some level. So when you ask them a question like, what are 3 things you'd like to be doing in 3 years? Common answers are mentoring, advising, investing, speaking, writing books, those kind of things. So for me, like I said, it was one of those things that I pursued my model of success at the time, which was to make as much money as possible, given the limited skill sets that I had, so to speak. So, and eventually I achieved that. And it's a pretty scary moment when, you climb this mountain, you get to the top of the mountain, and you're like, shoot, this is the wrong mountain. I have to climb the one over there, so to speak. So for me, like when I got out of that business, like I said, it was a hard decision to decide to scale down, because it was a successful business. And a lot of people I know would just stay in it and just kind of drudge through, day after day, because it pays the bills or supports their family and those kind of things. And for me, one thing I've always had is that when I've kind of realized that I'm on the wrong path, I have to make a change like right away. Like I can't delay the decision. Like the decision happens right away, and I can't keep continuing on, so to speak. So for me, I knew that I didn't want to, when I was in that transition period and basically had a blank slate as far as what I was going to do next on some level, I knew I just didn't want to pursue something for the sake of money, because I had already kind of fallen into that trap. And especially the business I was in before was e-commerce. So we didn't have any control over who we served. So, whoever bought, products from our website, it was ultimately our client. And I wanted that to be very different for my next business. And the reason we did this whole application only type model was because I want to be very selective as far as who I serve. And for me, the funny thing was, and what has been really the crux of all of our success over the years, because for context, we've had just over 17,000 entrepreneurs apply for a community that's capped at 150 people annually. Again, our 2019 event is sold out a year in advance. Our 2020 event, when we go to announce it, will be sold out rather soon as well. We've had all the success, and really the core of it really comes down to the curation of the community. And there's so many different ways you can curate a community. There's, there's organizations that are out there like EO or YPO where your business has to do a certain revenue figure, and that's the only barrier to entry. And that works when you want to build a community at scale on some level, but you won't have good quality throughout. So for me, what I did was when I initially had these phone calls, I tried to assess if they were the right fit. So I wanted to ensure that, them coming to MMT would be, they get some kind of like 10x ROI or something like that. I also would ask questions like, what's the most enticing aspect of the event that makes you want to join us? And if they say it's to meet Tim Ferriss or Lewis Howes or whoever, then that wasn't, that usually was a red flag that they weren't the right fit, because I don't want people to put other people on pedestals, and there's no soliciting our events and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, when I got off the phone with them, every single person, I'd ask myself, would I want to have dinner with this person? And if the answer was no, I didn't care how successful they were on paper, I would refund their money, or I just wouldn't extend an invitation to begin with. And I didn't know if that level of curation would pay off initially, but again, that's been really the main thing that has made us so successful over the last few years.
That's amazing. And I really love that you're really selective about it, because I think that's one thing, especially just looking at so many different communities, is understanding who you accept in and who's actually, getting the most out of the community. And if it's not built for like people that you select, definitely, it can get misguided and the missions can get misaligned and it can become a mess. So definitely love that you select people and they apply.
Yeah. I mean, there's a book called 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, and there's a line in it that I always keep in the back of my head, which is you stand for something or you stand for nothing. And you can't speak to everybody's model of the world. You simply can't. And in the whole context of a community, like, we all have a deep desire to be surrounded by like-minded individuals. And there's a philosophy that I talk about called uncommon commonalities. And the deeper the uncommon commonality that people share, the deeper the bond. So statistically, I'm going to see if I can get this right. I'm pretty sure I know it offhand, but statistically, if I were to walk out this office right now and meet 1,000 people at random, 3% of them would be entrepreneurs or business owners. Meaning, if I were to find myself at an event or at a dinner with 30 entrepreneurs, that's a pretty unique kind of experience. And most likely in that environment, I'll build deep bonds with them rather quickly because they're similar to me. Well, let's say you're an entrepreneur that has a 7-figure business. They represent 4% of that 3%. So you'd have to stop 25,000 people at random in order to meet 30 entrepreneurs with 7-figure businesses. So again, you find yourself at an event with only entrepreneurs with 7-figure businesses. That's a really unique opportunity. And generally in those environments, again, because those people are similar to you, the speed in which you kind of foster those relationships will increase kind of significantly. And then there's so many ways to cut that. I mean, you also could be an entrepreneur with 7-figure business with kids, or kids under the age of 5, or, formerly served in the military. Like, again, the stronger the uncommon commonality, the stronger the bond. So that's something we're definitely kind of very conscious of.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. And it totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. Yeah. So another thing that I was like really curious about was, kind of looking at your, the guests that you've had on your podcast, some of the people that you've mentioned earlier. What do some of the underdogs that have attended MMT look like? Like, who are some of those people that, after really considering it, you're like, wow, I actually would want to have dinner with this person, that kind of like surprised you, if you wouldn't mind sharing? If not, totally okay.
Yeah. I mean, well, so we don't, by the time somebody comes to Mastermind Talks, they've been heavily, heavily vetted. So there's usually no surprises. If there are surprises, it's usually something that's not good and they're removed. So, because usually like the good stuff is why I picked them in the first place.
Right.
We definitely do have so we have a scholarship program at Mastermind Talks. And basically for the last 2 years, we've partnered with an organization called the 5 Ventures, which basically helps men and women transition out of the prison system into entrepreneurship. Because one thing that they've discovered is that, if you've built a business selling drugs on the street, ultimately it's very similar to like the structure of any business for that matter. You're just pushing the wrong product, so to speak. So basically they help foster that hustle, so to speak, into, and lean that towards kind of business and entrepreneurship. So we've had we usually have about 5 or so people who've gone through the program join us at Mastermind Talks. And I would definitely consider those individuals on some level an underdog. And those people are always just super impressive. Just to hear their backstories and what they've overcome. And, your ego likes to think that there's a huge line dividing you and somebody who would do something illegal to end up in jail. But unfortunately, that's rarely the case. It's when you hear about their circumstances and what they've had to overcome. Given if you were in the same position, you'd probably make the same decisions on some level. So yeah, we try to have a well-balanced kind of community where it's not just uber successful people. We have kind of people at almost every level, because there's one thing I remember when I was if I could boil down my success to anything, is I've always surrounded myself on like people who are 2 or 3 levels ahead of me, so to speak. So, if I want to get fit, then I surround myself with people who are like triathletes or like marathon runners or that kind of stuff. Or if I want to make more money, I surround myself with entrepreneurs who are, crushing it in business. The only problem is when I was earlier in my entrepreneurial journey, those were the only people I surrounded myself with. And the end result is that you're always measuring up. So when you measure up, you always feel like crap. Your self-worth goes down the drain because you're always, measuring to people that are higher than you. And you're like, why am I the most broke person in my peer group? And why am I the most out of shape? And that kind of stuff. So the one thing I've done on a personal level, and we've applied this to our community, is that it's like the law of 33%. I try to spend a third of my time with people who are above me. So I can feel kind of inspired, and unconsciously what it does, it pushes you to get to their level as quickly as possible so you can feel like you belong, because we all have a deep desire to belong. I spend a third of my time with people who are quote unquote at my level, my peer group, so to speak, because we all have a deep desire to feel understood. And then I try to spend or invest a third of my time with people who I could kind of lift up, so to speak, and mentor and support. And we've taken that model to our community at MMT. And so we have people who you'd consider, I guess, underdogs. We have people who are incredibly successful, and kind of everything in between. And we're very conscious about that mix.
I love that. And I actually would love to unpack that a little bit further. Sure. When you were talking about, people that were above your level, at your level, or people that were below your level, how do you deal with those interactions, like in between? Like for the people above you, like I remember when I was a triple jumper, I always kind of knew the people that were ready to show up and compete. And we always knew that, on the national level, these were the people that were going to show up and be there. So I feel like it's kind of a similar way when you have people in business. It's like, oh, we've all been here. We've achieved these things and we're on the same level. So could you talk a little bit about your relationships between the different tiers?
Yeah. So how do I treat them differently?
Yeah, I guess, or like what's something that someone who's looking to surround themselves with someone who's 2 to 3 levels above them, like what are some things that you do or have done that they might be able to use? Because I feel like sometimes that can get intimidating for people.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can be like, oh, am I being annoying? Do they really want to spend time with me at all? So I guess if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's Kevin Spacey has a saying that when you achieve a certain level of success, it's almost a responsibility to send the elevator back down. So a lot of successful people I know, or what would you qualify as successful, have a strong desire. Again, as I mentioned, they move from success to significance. And I've made some really great relationships with people who are incredibly successful because I can help them with that significance piece. And for me, the way I do it is, I can support them with like coming out with a book or book marketing, or help them launch a podcast, or get them on speaking stages, or those kind of things. So that's how I can be of value to them and show up for them. There's also like the mentor-mentee relationship. And again, like anybody who's had any level of success nobody's does anything great alone, right? They've had support along the way. They've had somebody believe in them along the way, that kind of stuff. So generally there's always this innate desire to pay it forward and send the elevator back down. So it's funny. I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently who's really, really successful. And we talked about the whole idea of like mentorship and how it played a role in his life and all that kind of stuff. And to my surprise, I asked him like something like, I'm like, you must get hit up all the time for somebody to be mentored by you and that kind of stuff. And he's like, surprisingly, no. He's like, nobody reaches out to me, because there's this like idea that because he's so successful and because he's so busy that he'd never say yes. But the truth of the matter is nobody's just ever asked. So there is definitely, from a successful person's vantage point, there's always a strong desire to kind of, again, support and help that quote unquote next generation and pay it forward and all that kind of stuff. So that's almost like this common misconception, because people think that the more successful people get, the more almost detached they are from that notion, and the busier they are, and obviously they are busier. There's more time demands, but oftentimes what grows underneath that is that strong desire to help and support, because they were supported at one point in time. As far as the other side of things, I mean, generally one of the biggest thing is this. There's a saying. How does it go? In the dating world, there's this whole notion of, would you date yourself? So if you're single and you're on the market, would you date yourself? Meaning, if you want to date, a very pretty lady who's like a 10 out of 10, and, she's fit, athletic, successful, and you live at home with your parents and play video games, and you're out of shape, good luck with that on some level, right? Like likes attract like. So the same notion with, if you want to have somebody mentor you, are you worth almost investing in on some level? Like what makes you fascinating? And, what are you, when you get information, do you take action on it? Or you just, do you have a hard time being coached and those kind of things? There's a lot of, to me, it's almost like you have to get your own house in order before you start reaching out to people to kind of help you or support you or even be friends with you. So, and that's stuff all within kind of your control. Because I know one of the biggest complaints I have and friends of mine have as well is when somebody asks you for advice or for something, you give them advice or you open a door for them and they don't do anything with it. And that's more common than you could possibly believe. It happens all the time. So if you're one of those individuals that like ask for, some advice, you get that advice back and you take action on it and you show that person, they'll be much more likely to kind of reinvest into that relationship. So, and make it more reciprocal. And also there's one important thing to note that like, there's just this whole notion of, fake it till you make it. Like sometimes you connect with somebody who is not that successful yet. But they have this like ego around it, or they are playing this whole like fake it till you make it type thing. And the best relationships I've built, like the baseline for it when I reach out to somebody, is just blatant kind of transparency of like saying like, hey, whatever, I'm 18, just dropped out of high school. This is what I'm looking to do. I admire your work. Here's X, Y, and Z, like some of the reasons why. And just that brutally honest kind of outreach and that transparency goes a long way, because again, there's a lot of, there's a whole saying that like fake news doesn't just apply to politics. It applies to like Instagram and like Facebook and the way we portray ourselves to be like, living these perfect lives and that kind of stuff. And that comes across when people try to build relationships with successful people or kind of reach up, so to speak, and people can see right through it. So just, it's much more refreshing to be just blatantly transparent as far as like where you are, where you want to go, why that person specifically can help or support you, and approach it from that perspective.
Yeah, no, I love that. Totally love that. And I think the brutally honest is something that's very hard for people to do nowadays, because I feel like so many people are afraid of hurting people's feelings and just not sure how to tell the truth all the time, sure, especially about what they want and what they're passionate or curious about. So definitely love that, brutal honesty. I guess another thing I've been curious about is how you stay connected with so many people throughout the year. Mm-hmm. Since, MMT is such a huge part of a year and your sole focus is on that, like how do you stay connected with your community?
So my relationships in general, or just with the community?
Just your relationships in general, like with your friends, family. peers?
There's something called Dunbar's number. So Robin Dunbar is a social anthropologist, I think. And basically, years ago, he discovered that humans have a cognitive limitation as far as the amount of social relationships they can have at a single point in time. And he capped that at about 150. And that's dependent on IQ. So it's variable. Like some people could do 180, some people could do 200, some people could do less. But on average, it's about 150. And they have a ton of research and a ton of science that backs this up. And any quote unquote master networker or whatever, super connector, however you want to frame them, anyone that I know, I've never met one that actually manages relationships well at scale. I don't think it can be done. I think CRMs help. I think Facebook and Instagram and those kind of platforms help. But at the end of the day, we all have this cognitive limit. And I think instead of trying to work against it, acknowledging it is probably the right direction. And that's how kind of I approach things. So Dunbar's number is set at 150. And when I look at my relationships, actually the one misconception about Dunbar is that he just has that number of 150, which is not true. He actually has a scale of numbers that basically shows the intensity of different relationships. So his smallest, the way I think of it, like from a visual perspective, is like if you dropped a stone in a pond, in a still pond, and you see like the water ripples. So the smallest kind of circle, or the smallest ripple, so to speak, would be like your kin relationships, which are ultimately generally like your family and those kind of things. And usually that's capped at about 5 people. And these people tend to be like those that have your back. And there's actually, oddly enough, there's a book written by Keith Ferrazzi. He wrote a book called Never Eat Alone, which is really popular, but he wrote another book called Who's Got Your Back? And in that book, they interviewed 1,000 people at random. And they asked them one question and one question only: who has your back? Surprisingly, 55% of people felt like nobody had their back. Even more surprisingly, 60% of those people were married. So we live in a time where, social isolation is a huge problem. And we fall into this fallacy that because we have 500 Facebook friends that we have actual relationships, which, proves to not be the case. Like I always say, like, it doesn't matter how many friends you could count. It matters how many friends you can count on. So for me, I'm very conscious of like, who are those 5 relationships, or 4 to 6 relationships that are like my core relationships, that are people who have my back, that, if I got divorced tomorrow, I could sleep on their couch, so to speak. Like that's my filter. And if you don't have those relationships, it's really important to foster those relationships. So even if you only have one, ensuring that you keep that relationship kind of paramount and top of mind before anything else. So that's the core group. The second group is connectors. And that's usually like 20 to 25 people that I have in that group at a time. And these are people I created this group because I did a dinner, for example, last year in this city that I live in called Waterloo, which is an hour outside of Toronto. And the reason I did the dinner, like I do most dinners, is just to, connect with fascinating people locally. And when I did this dinner, I had about 40 people at it, and most of them I didn't know well. And these were like some really big movers and shakers locally. And the one thing is that I realized there was a guy who came in who was a lawyer, who's kind of born and raised in the city. And he knew about 95% of the people at that dinner. And after the dinner, I thought to myself, I'm like, I could either try to maintain these 40 relationships, or I can just build a deep relationship with him. And he can be like that catalyst that, like, if I need something locally, he's connected with that person. And I have a few friends like that who are almost like these nodes, or these connectors, so to speak. So instead of like, there's a whole notion of like, I'd rather have 4 quarters than 100 pennies, right? It's much easier to manage 4 relationships versus 100. So I have a group of quote unquote connectors that I try to invest a lot of, time with, so to speak, as far as nurturing those relationships, because I know those relationships almost work at scale on some level. Then I have community, which is like 150 who are like my peers. And thankfully, given the work that I do, it falls within like the people that we serve at Mastermind Talks, because, we have 150 people at Mastermind Talks. I'd have 135 of them to my wedding. I mean, these are my favorite people on the planet. So I'm in a very blessed position where the lines between work and life are and friends and all that kind of stuff are very much blurred. So, but community is ultimately like your peer group. So even if you're not in my position, just who are your peers or your like-minded individuals. And then once you go above that, then I have Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fan Theory, which is basically the philosophy around that is that if you have 1,000 true fans, you can be creative of any kind. You could be like a music artist, a magician, a performer. If you have 1,000 true fans, you can earn a solid living. That's kind of my philosophy of like when people follow me on Facebook and Instagram, or like my Facebook friends and that kind of stuff would generally fall within that, like that 1,000 true fan theory. And then I have like but like my community that's like 1,000 or more that just like are random followers on platforms, social platforms, and that kind of stuff. So I try to be very conscious of like where I allocate my time and who's in those buckets, so that I don't just have this sea of friends where I go a millimeter deep in a million different directions. I want to go deep with a very core group of people, which is again, the core group, core group, connectors, and then community.
Got it. But I love that. I think that's such a great model that people can start to think about, because once you realize that there's only, so much you can actually pack into your relationships,
sure,
then people will start, being more thoughtful about who they actually spend their time with, which is, I think, the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, the truth of the matter is it takes work, right? Like investing in relationships takes work, takes time, takes bandwidth. And again, like I see so many people, and I'm guilty of this as well, just spreading themselves way too thin and you can't treat all relationships the same. You simply can't, and you need to prioritize them. So that's the model I've somewhat kind of introduced in my own life over the last 2 years or so, and it's been working really well.
Nice, awesome. So I kind of want to switch things up just a tiny bit.
Sure.
And kind of want to go back into the younger Jayson. And kind of, could you tell us a little bit about how it felt when you took that first piece of advice that you got from, one of your first mentors and saw either, something work or something go bad? Or could you just tell us like what you learned from that moment?
Yeah. So my first mentor ever, my first like official mentor, because I think also the whole notion of like mentorship, people are like, I need to find that one mentor. But the truth of the matter is we live in such a beautiful time when you can be mentored by almost anybody virtually. So if you want to, if you're a fan of Seth Godin, yes, you can like reach out to Seth and do lunch with him and that kind of stuff. But he has millions of written words out there on his blog and his books and all that kind of stuff. You could consume, like you could dedicate a full month, if not more, just digging into his work. And he can be almost through osmosis, like a mentor on some level. And then once you go through all that, then maybe you can reach out to him and say like, hey, I need to go from like good to great information and maybe we can sit down type thing. But for me, my first mentor, I remember vividly, there was a magazine locally here, similar to like an Inc. magazine for business. And there was this guy who was featured in it who would help entrepreneurs get secure loans and grants and stuff like that from the government. And I was 18 at the time. And I'm like, I've always heard about these like grants for young entrepreneurs, but I have no clue how to like where to find information or how to be considered for one. So I sent him an email and I said, is this something you could help me with? And politely he said like, no, like he specializes more in like tech companies and all that kind of stuff. So I said, okay. So the following month, that same magazine did a 3-page spread or 6-page spread actually on me and my business. And as far as like what we were focused on for the next 18 months and all that kind of stuff. And that same guy saw it and he ended up reaching back out to me and he said, like, you know what, let's do dinner. And this actually somewhat plays into like, are you promising as an individual, right? Because initially when I reached out, he had no context. He didn't think anything special of me, so to speak. But when he saw the magazine article, he's like, well, this is somebody who's, again, promising on some level. So he reached out. We ended up going for dinner. And I remember we were talking just about the business. I think I was probably doing about $5,000 a month at the time. And he, towards the end of the dinner, he's like, imagine a time when you're doing like $80,000 a month. And I remember like saying, oh yeah, like I could totally see it like intellectually, but emotionally, I'm like, that's never going to happen for me. There's no way whatsoever I'll be able to, build a business where I'm doing $80,000 a month. But lo and behold, about 3.5 years later, him and I stayed in touch throughout the years, but 3.5 years later, we did our first $900,000 a month. And that's when it hit me. That's when I had that memory that only 3 years prior, I couldn't imagine doing, a tenth of that. And now I'm doing, 10x that amount. So it just goes to show like the power of your peers, so to speak, and the power of being a proximity to people who think bigger. And that fundamentally kind of shifted everything for me, because I very much had a limiting belief that I was never going to grow a business past kind of what I was already at.
Love that. And it definitely reminds people of the, become so good that they can't ignore you. That quote. And it seems like you were doing that and you had the early signs of it. And then someone was like, hey, come here. Let's sit down for dinner. And then it was like, oh, wow, like this kid actually is, up to something great. Thanks so much for sharing that story, Jayson.
And I love that quote. I use it all the time because, again, so many people are in a rush to like connect with all these big names and all that kind of stuff. But it's very different when you reach out to somebody who's a big name and you're like, hey, can you help me? And all this kind of stuff, versus if they hear about you and they see you almost as like a peer. So there's definitely some big name people that one day I'd like to, meet and connect with and that kind of stuff. But, I, instead of focusing my energy on trying to, speed up that process, so to speak, I focus my energy on just doing great work and making my own little mark. And because ultimately we want to be connected to again, like-minded individuals and people who we see as assets. Trying to foster and sharpen my own kind of unique abilities so that, when the opportunity comes for me to cross paths with these individuals, I can be seen as not only a peer, but an asset to them.
Nice. No, couldn't agree with that more. Awesome. And kind of one last question that not sure. I guess I'll just go with it.
Sure.
What's a topic that you're incredibly interested in, but you haven't really shared with a lot of people?
Oh, interested in, but haven't shared with a lot of people. I don't know. It's interesting because I tend to be a pretty transparent person when it comes to like my personal life and business life and that kind of stuff. The one thing that I think is timely, and it's something I haven't formulated a full viewpoint on yet, is the whole notion of diversity. And because I believe in the whole philosophy of diversity and inclusion, for sure, obviously being in the community space. But I think, some people are going about it the wrong way. And I see that in events where they have like a specific quota of like, we need X amount of these people, X amount of that people, and it doesn't work. So it's one of those things that I want to talk about, and not talk about like, hey, I have the answers, but I want to participate in these kind of discussions with folks, but I still haven't fully formulated my own kind of views on it. I'm still very much in the collection phase, so to speak. So talking to a lot of people, trying to figure out what I think the best direction is, and then have people kind of poke holes at it. So that's one thing I haven't shared much, but it's in the back of my mind, and I definitely want to lean into that more in the future.
Love that. And if you need someone to help poke holes, feel free. I would love to help.
I appreciate it. I know, especially in the line of work that you do. Like I said, it's a hot topic in the event space, in the community space, even when it comes to diversity on stages, like the amount of men versus women that are on panels and that kind of stuff. And I don't think it's a clear-cut kind of answer or solution out there. But it's definitely a discussion I want to participate in, because, we've been doing this for 6 years, and I think there's pros and cons to what's out there in the marketplace. And so like I said, that's kind of going to be an area of focus over the next little bit, is getting clear on my own kind of personal thoughts, my own philosophies, and then just having great conversations with great people, and then see if we can come to some kind of solution together.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I really love how you mentioned that you're in the collection phase, and really respect that a lot, that you're currently forming your opinion around it. And was listening to Gary Vee the other day, and he says this over and over again, but he says that he doesn't predict the future. Mm-hmm. He just talks about what's actually happening right now. And before, he goes out and says anything, he actually executes and practices, the different strategies and tactics that he's actually talking about. Mm-hmm. So I really, really, you just want to point that out. And let people know that like it's not a coincidence that you both approach, forming your opinions and ideas in similar ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have no problem being wrong and being proven wrong.
Right.
The thing is like, I don't, maybe it has to do with the times with like social media, that everything you say, especially the more public you get, it is recorded. So like it makes you really think and really be methodical about how you view things and what you say, because if you say something stupid that you haven't fully thought through, that may haunt you for the rest of your life, as it should. And I think it just puts people on their toes, and it just puts more of an emphasis on like, I want to have kind of everything lined up and everything, but also being open to be proven wrong, even when I have everything lined up. So yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. And one last actual question.
Sure.
I think this might be a better one to end on, and then we can kind of
Sorry,
here.
I went too long on that question or took it in a different direction.
Oh, no, it's all good. That's the beauty of post-production. So what is the biggest misconception about you?
That I like people. It is a misconception. And like people, I don't, it's weird. Given the space that I'm in, given that I'm quote unquote the relationship guy, like I was named by Forbes as like one of the top networkers to watch and all this kind of stuff. So this is natural assumption that A, I'm this huge extrovert, which I'm not. And that B, I love all people. And I don't. I love a core group of people deeply. So like the people that we that are in our community and all that kind of stuff, like I would take a bullet for the majority of those people. Like these are some of my favorite people on the planet. And I do have like, a soft spot for the world and different, initiatives and causes and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm just very focused when it comes to my bandwidth and almost like my empathy as well on some level. And it's weird because I just care about a core group of people incredibly, incredibly deeply, to the point that they're, almost like family. And they are. I mean, we're doing a family vacation every year as part of Mastermind Talks. We do a family vacation. And, we have 23 families that are joining us. We're doing a Disney cruise in February. So we're all flying to Miami. We're doing this 6-day cruise together. And that's just a misconception, is that I love everybody and all that kind of stuff. And although I do like a lot of people, I care about a core group of people above everything else.
Got it. No, that makes total sense. And it's funny too, because one of my other guests, Jessica Lynn from Workbench, she also had the same exact thing. She is, not this, outgoing person all the time, but it's crazy that I also feel a similar way. And it's very interesting that we all say that about ourselves when we're in this, like, such a public and people facing, position.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's something a lot of people I know talk about behind the scenes.
Awesome. Well, Jayson, this has been such a fun conversation. For those listening that want to follow up or learn more about what you do, where can people, contact you or find you online? Yeah.
So, I mean, all those I have a pretty unique name. So thankfully I have like all the social media handles as Jayson Gaignard. So JaysonGaignard. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram is something I'm finally leaning into now. So those are some ways you can reach out or just kind of stay up to what I'm working on. And then Mastermind Talks is MMT.community is the website, and Community Made is a podcast I have, which is communitymade.com.
Awesome. Well, you guys have heard it first here. Super happy that Jayson hopped on with us today, and I will link out to all of those links in the show notes. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Community Builder Podcast. If you like this show and want to know more, check out the website, communitybuildershow.com, or please leave me a review on iTunes. Join us next week when I sit down with Jessica Lynn.